Welcome to Legends of the Barbed Wire Hotel. I didn't grow up hearing my father's stories of war. He never talked about the cold, the fear, or the time he spent in a German prisoner of war camp. Like so many veterans, he carried his service quietly. It was only after he was gone that I started searching for answers, reading letters, researching history, trying to understand the man behind the silence. That search led me to other veterans, men and women who served, who also sacrificed, and who also deserved to be remembered. Around kitchen tables, in quiet living rooms, I've listened to their voices, sometimes shaky, sometimes strong. That's why I do this, because no American who served should be forgotten. Not now, not ever. Today, I have the honor of sharing the story of Captain Edward Bender. Ed answered his country's call not once, but over and over again. He served in Vietnam aboard destroyers, led through crisis and tragedy, and rose to the highest ranks without ever chasing glory. He stood the watch across decades, from combat zones to intelligence briefings, from Navy decks to NATO command rooms. And through it all, he stayed grounded by his values, his love for family, and his unwavering commitment to this nation. Ed didn't just serve in uniform. He lived a life of service, a patriot, a leader, and a quiet American hero. I am Diana Maul Halstead, the Kriegie's daughter, and this is a story I am honored to share with you. Ed, I welcome you to the Barbed Wire Hotel.
Thank you.
First of all, when were you in the military?
I started out, I was a midshipman in the Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps at Villanova University from 1965 to 1969. I got commissioned an ensign in the Navy upon graduation in 1969. So I went on active duty in 1969, and I stayed in active and reserve status until October 1993.
When did you first have interest in the military?
Oh, as a young boy. I grew up in Baltimore, and I always wanted to go to the Naval Academy. That was my plan, is to go to the Naval Academy. It didn't happen because being from Maryland, it's very competitive to get an appointment to the Naval Academy. And I actually pursued it with my senator from Maryland, but found out that because I was not an All-American lacrosse player, that he was only picking All-American lacrosse players for the academy. So I went back to my high school guidance counselor, and he said, well, maybe what you ought to do is apply for the Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps scholarship. So I got that, and then I went to Villanova University in Philadelphia and spent 4 years there, in which I was a midshipman there. And every summer between years at Villanova, I won a 6 to 8 week cruise.
I mean, that sounds really nice to go on a cruise.
Well, it's not.
Not for the military.
No, it's not. No.
Did you come from a military family?
My father was in the Army, and he was in the Battle of the Bulge in World War II. Yeah, he was in the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions and fought in the Battle of the Bulge and actually marched into Berlin at the end of the war. So, 1945, yes. That's the military background in my family. I've always wanted to go in the Navy. I always did. And I wanted to be on a Navy fighting ship. I was on destroyers. I didn't want to go in the submarine corps, and I didn't want to go in the Navy aviation. I get chances to, on these midshipman summer cruises, I had a chance to, a couple weeks of flight training, a couple weeks of marine training. I never got any submarine training other than going on a submarine and submerging in the Mediterranean. And I quickly realized I didn't want to be didn't want to be in the submarine.
How many ships were you on?
I was on two. I was on two destroyers in Vietnam, one in 1969. We were home ported in Newport, Rhode Island, and we got changed home ports to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and shortly thereafter went to Vietnam in the spring of 1970. And I left that ship in the fall of 1970 and went to another ship that ended up going to Vietnam in the summer of 1972. So it was two destroyers.
What were their names?
It was the USS Lloyd Thomas and the USS Dewey. And the Lloyd Thomas was a straight destroyer, and the Dewey was a guided missile destroyer. So we had, on the Dewey, we had guided missiles in addition to guns, where on the Lloyd Thomas was primarily guns.
What was your job?
I was the communications officer. But in addition to being communications officer, I was the officer of the deck at general quarters. So I trained to be the officer of the deck during times when we were at general quarters status.
When you were in Villanova in the reserve, and then you went into the active status.
I went into active status, right.
As what rank?
Ensign. Everybody gets commissioned as an ensign.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, I wasn't even in reserve status at that time at Villanova. I was a midshipman at that time. So I was a midshipman, just like a Naval Academy midshipman. And then I got commissioned as an ensign as what they call USN, which is regular Navy, not reserve. So I was on the 2 destroyers. Yeah. Mainly what we did was we were in the Gulf of Tonkin and we followed aircraft carriers and we did plane guarding for the aircraft carriers. So as they flew missions over North Vietnam, we would be there in case that one of the airplanes went down, missed the carrier, didn't land, and we would be there to pick up the pilot and everything. And then we also did gunfire support in South Vietnam, where we would be anchored maybe 12 miles, 10 miles off the coast and just fire 5-inch shells there all day and all night. We were firing at the Viet Cong on land. We knew where the enemy, so to speak, was, and we would fire.
Now, is that something that the communications guy learns, like where they are, or you see the smoke or something like that?
We get intelligence that tells us where they are, that type of thing. We get intelligence messages that tells us the coordinates of where to fire.
Did you work with air support?
Yes, primarily was helicopter support.
Was it Vietnam the first time they really used helicopters?
Pretty much so, yeah.
How far off of shore were you?
About 10 miles. The guns could fire 10 to 12 miles.
And Vietnam wasn't very big.
No.
Were there any real challenges?
When firing, you would be firing all day and all night. Challenges to be able to get some sleep, because when you fire these guns, they make a tremendous amount of noise and they rock the ship and all that sort of thing. But the biggest challenge that we faced was, unfortunately, believe it or not, it was 9/11, 1970. So way before the 9/11 that you and I are familiar with. But on September 11th, 1970, we were firing, and I was on the bridge, and one of our mounts blew up internally and immediately killed 3 people and wounded the other 11 people in the mount. It was faulty ammunition that we had received, and instead of the ammunition being propelled outward, it blew up inside the mount. And so there were 14 people inside the mount. Like I said, it killed 3 people instantaneously, and the rest of them were injured. We immediately helicoptered everybody off the ship and then went back to the Philippines, and they immediately took mangled mount off the ship. And we then spent some time searching for a new mount. And we ended up going to Yokosuka, Japan, at the naval station there, because they had another mount that they could put on the ship. But even before then, while they were searching for a mount for us, we would go back and do plane guarding for the aircraft carriers.
It's scary that could happen.
It was probably the worst day of my life.
You just trust that those things are going to
Yeah, you
happen.
do. You do. And actually, I was very fortunate because I was on the bridge. The mount was right in front of me, maybe 50 feet. And the mount was trained to the starboard side, which is the right side. And it has 2 barrels on it, okay? The barrel that the accident took place was in the left-hand barrel, and the barrel blew off the ship and then exploded in there. If it would have been the right-hand barrel, it would have come extremely close to me. So it could have hit the bridge, and who knows what would have happened then.
I mean, it's like your life flashes before your eyes.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. The unfortunate thing, I mean, I don't blame myself for anything, but I was the one that gave the batteries released on the thing, because if we've been shooting for 5 to 7 days constantly and nothing had been a problem other than the fact that it was making a lot of noise and the ship would shake all day long. But the captain, who usually is on the bridge to give batteries released, he said to me, as long as the mount is pointed in the right direction, give him batteries released. So I gave him batteries released, and I had my back to the bridge. When I turned around, all of a sudden I knew immediately that something was wrong because the noise was totally different. than what we had had before. And so we went back to the Philippines, but before we even left, they took the dead and the wounded off.
I can't fathom that. I guess the thing is when you hear them fire day and night, day and night, day and night, and then you hear something that's missed.
It's so routine, and then when something is odd, you know it right away.
What was your family dynamic when growing up? Your dad was in the Army. Was he in the Army while you were little, or was he in the Army before?
He was in the Army before I was born. He went into the Army in World War II in 1942, and he stayed until the end of 1945 and came home.
What inspired him to go? Pearl Harbor?
I think so, yes.
Was he in high school then?
No, actually, my father was an old sergeant in the Army. When he went into the Army, he was 31 years old. Yeah, he was born in 1911, so he went in the Army in 42. So he was 31 years old. He was the old man in his group. He went in because he wanted to. My dad had been a banker from the time he graduated from high school, which was in 1929. It's right at the time of the crash. He went into banking, yeah.
Oh my gosh, so he went from banker to
the Army, yeah. My mother and he were married, I think, 1939. So they'd only been married for 2 years when he went into the Army. And it's totally different, like, even though I'd gone to Vietnam twice, I was home within the year each time. He went in the Army, and I don't think they saw each other for 3 years because he went to training in North Carolina. Then they shipped him over to England, and he got ready for the D-Day and what happened afterwards.
During World War II, you were given in the Army Air Force that you do so many flights and then you go home. I don't know how it is with the Army, but I'm sure they had something like that.
I'm sure that there was some point in time between the time he enlisted to the time he parachuted into France that he had gone home for maybe a weekend or a week or something like that. I didn't realize how bad the Battle of the Bulge was when I was growing up. And I listened to stories, and the stories really didn't impact me like they impact me today. And if you watch the 10-episode series on Band of Brothers, that takes you through the Battle of the Bulge. And then I realized how bad it was. I mean, basically, they fought through the Ardennes forest all the way through France into Germany in the wintertime. And it was snowy and cold. I never realized how bad it was.
Did your dad ever talk about it?
Talked about it all the time. He really did. He talked about it all the time. He did. He ended up going to reunions of the 101st Airborne Division. And I never went to the reunions with him. My mother and my sister did. Even at times, he'd be sitting around with some friends and stuff, and they would talk about it. But it was sort of over my head, and I didn't realize the significance of the whole thing.
So then you were born after he came home?
I was born in 47, after he came home. And then my sister was born 5 years after me, and that's just the two of us. And then, like I said, there was a show about the Navy submarine force, although, as I said, I didn't want to be on submarines. Oh, and there was a show about the Naval Academy growing up. And so I sort of liked watching that, and I sort of felt that from a very young age, I wanted to go into the Navy. There was no doubt that it was actually almost fun because in college, which was really sort of the height of 65 to 69, which was probably the height of the Vietnam War, the draft had already been initiated. My number was 17 or something like that, but it didn't make any difference. I was already in the Navy. And I was seeing classmates who were scrambling, trying to figure out how they could not be drafted and things like that. And I'm going, I'm already going, so it doesn't make any difference to me. So it was actually funny to see that happen.
Yeah. What were your summers like when you were at Villanova?
Well, the first summer I went on a cruise on a supply ship, and we went down to the Dominican Republic because I don't know if you recall, but in the early 80s, the U.S. had sent a bunch of soldiers down there to quell an uprising in the Dominican Republic. The ship went down to pick up a bunch of supplies that were left over from that theater. And then I went to New York City. But during that year, which was between your fourth class year and your third class year, that's your freshman and sophomore year, I was assimilated into the enlisted ranks. So I lived with the enlisted ranks and all that kind of stuff. The next summer, we spent 3 weeks in Dam Neck, Virginia, learning what the Marines do. And I also quickly learned I didn't want to be a Marine. And then we also went to Corpus Christi, Texas, and did 3 weeks of flight training. So that was that year. Then in my last cruise between my junior and my senior year, I was on a destroyer in the Mediterranean. And that was really neat because we went to, well, I picked up the ship in Malta. We went to places like Istanbul. We went to Libya. And this was before Gaddafi. Gaddafi was not in power yet. Yeah. We went to Libya. I went to Istanbul. I think we went to a few other places. The one to Istanbul, I barely survived, literally, because we went with a carrier task force into Istanbul. And if you ever see the picture of the big blue mosque in Istanbul, which is sort of a famous landmark there, it sits on sort of a top of a hill, and there's a big graded parking area or something that goes down to the docks. And the day we arrived, we went into Istanbul, and we were on Liberty. And as the evening kept going, it looked like there was things brewing in the city where there was a lot of young people who were sort of gathering because they felt that we had nuclear weapons on the aircraft carrier. And you could see they were starting to gather together. So the 2 other guys that I was with, we got into a taxi cab and asked them to take us down to Fleet Landing. And it was just in time, because once we got to Fleet Landing and got the boat back to the ship, because we were anchored out, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of students coming down the hill from the mosque, and they were burning all the cars and all that kind of stuff. So that was the end of our liberty in Istanbul, and we were scheduled to leave. That was like a Monday, and we were scheduled, midshipmen on the ship, there's 4 or 5 of us, we were scheduled to leave Istanbul to fly back to the States. And every day, these students would come down and set things on fire and wave at us. They would, clenched fists, they would wave at us until the last day. And I'll always remember this. The last day, they were coming down the hill. Before they came down the hill, the Turkish army came down, and the Turkish army lined the dock, the pier there, the shoreline, and waited for the students to come. And as the students came down the hill, they fired at the students point blank and probably dropped about a couple dozen of them. And that was the end of the protests. Protests were over. The Turkish army is renowned for being pretty ruthless. They don't stand and wait. So they were tired of doing this for like 3 days, having this happen for 3 days. So they were brought in and took out a bunch of students, and that was it. The next day, we took the boat to the Fleet Landing there and took a bus to the airport and got out of Istanbul.
Did those protests feel like ones that you see the college kids do today?
Yeah, I would say they were pretty similar, to what the college kids do today, yeah.
I remember the protests in the 60s and 70s over Vietnam because I was in high school, but you don't think about it in other parts of the country.
Oh, no, these are very violent protests. And see, I didn't see the protests much in the States, because, first of all, Villanova is a very conservative school. So the school itself embraced the NRTC. So we didn't have any of the problems like you might have had, like at places like Kent State or something like that. So so once again, that was between my junior and senior year. And at that time, as I said, the first cruise, I was an enlisted man. This cruise, I was assimilated into the officer corps of the ship.
Did you feel included?
Yes, pretty much. I mean, I thought the officer corps, because, by that time, some of the officers were only maybe 2 years older than me. Some of these guys had just graduated from college, and I was just going into my senior year. So maybe 2 years older than me. Then after I graduated from Villanova, I went to my first ship, the Lloyd Thomas, within 30 days. So I graduated in May of 69 and went right to the ship in June of 69. And we stayed in Newport, except we went to Gitmo, to Guantanamo Bay for 2 months for training, and then came back. And then we changed on ports to Hawaii. And that was an interesting evolution because from Newport, we had to refuel a bunch of places. So we went to Newport, we refueled in Key West. Then we went through the Panama Canal and we refueled in Panama. And then we had to go to San Diego to refuel again. And then from San Diego all the way over to Pearl Harbor. There's no place to refuel other than a ship, and we didn't have another ship with us. So, and then it was funny because the second ship I was on was also home ported in Newport, and I thought that we were going to go to a Mediterranean cruise, which would have been nice. But a week before the Mediterranean cruise was going to take place, they changed our orders and sent us to Vietnam. And that was another very long. We left Newport, Rhode Island, and we picked up a destroyer, an aircraft carrier, and an oiler off of Norfolk. And we never hit land between Newport, Rhode Island and Subic Bay, Philippines.
How did that feel?
It was very boring. It was very boring.
Were you ever at any risk on those cruises?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, basically we're just trying to get from point A to point B. It just happened to be, maybe 12,000 miles away or something like that.
You were trying to get to where you needed to go, and then you would do your job.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, when you're on a ship like that, as a communications officer, I had the responsibility for all the electronic communications, the visual communications, and the postal clerk. They all worked for me. So you had responsibilities there, but if you had good enlisted people working for you, your duties were pretty much taken care of by, say, your senior chief petty officer or something like that. Yeah. Because while you're at sea, you stand watches, and they're 4-hour watches, and usually you stand 1 and 3 or 1 and 4. If you're lucky, you stand 1 and 4, which means you're 4 hours on and 12 hours off. If you're 1 and 3, you're 4 hours on and 8 hours off. So you've not only got your duties for your department, you also have your duties of sailing the ship. And if you talk about challenges, I think some of the biggest challenges that we had were weather challenges. I think I went through about 10 typhoons in the first cruise. It's not for the faint of heart to go through a typhoon on a ship that rolls like that. You got to remember, if you go on a cruise, those big ships have stabilizers. We don't have stabilizers. We don't have stabilizers. The ocean can be merciless. I mean, I took what was called a 56-degree roll. Now, 56-degree roll, if you're sitting like that, a 56-degree roll is like that, okay? And when you're on the bridge of the ship, you're basically being tossed from one side of the ship to the other. You just have to hold on to whatever you can hold on to. And that's scary because at any moment we thought that we were going to capsize. So we didn't have automatic pilots and things like that. This is just past Korean War stuff. There wasn't the sophistication on these ships that are there today. I mean, even the radios. I mean, everything's now satellite communications. I mean, our radios were high frequency radios and things like that. Even the guns were not sophisticated guns. They weren't automatic. That's why we had 14 people in a gun mount, because everybody had a job. Somebody had to take the shell and move it, and someone had to put the shell on, and someone had to take the empty shell off, and things like that. And then you had spotters, and you had a mount captain. You had all kinds of people on board in this mount. And nowadays, these mounts, they don't have anybody in them. They're automatic. Everything's automatic. I mean, it was tough. It was tough, But I have to say, the times that it was tough were like in between a lot of what I would call very boring isn't the word. It's just sort of normal stuff, just being at sea for a long time.
Was your last position Vietnam?
Yeah. After I left Vietnam on the second ship, I got myself ordered to the Naval Security Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. Because of being a communications officer, part of my duties was communication security, and I enjoyed the communication security part of the job. So I got myself ordered to a land job at the Naval Security Group headquarters in Washington, D.C. And I spent 3 years there. And the most significant thing that I did there was pretty unique. In fact, I've had some rather unique things go through my career in order to retire as a captain. I retired as a captain and I never had command of a ship. And that's almost unheard of. But I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through. But as a lieutenant, I had made lieutenant, which is the same thing as a captain in the Air Force or Army. I got assigned to an activity Right around this time, President Nixon and Schlesinger had negotiated a deal for grain shipments to move from the States to Russia, or to the Soviet Union at that time. And someone decided that we should determine whether or not Russian ships, when they came into our ports, were getting electronic information off of all the naval bases and army bases and stuff like that, and whether or not we were divulging anything to the Russian ships. We had 40 ports that we gave them, and they had 40 ports that they gave us. So we went to the 40 ports, and clandestinely, because we didn't wear uniforms or anything, we would go around and we would take a look at what electronic emissions were being out in the open so that they could just pick those up. And then we would write reports that would go all the way up to the Secretary of State to see whether or not we should, the next round, block these ports from the Russian ships to come in.
Did you find any?
We found a lot of stuff, yes.
I mean, like, so they were learning stuff.
Yeah, they were learning a lot of stuff. Oh yeah, we found a lot of stuff. And I'll tell you, a lot of the stuff was because a lot of at that time, telephone communications were open. We had the ability to listen into all this stuff. We had our own equipment that we could listen into what was going on. And I remember we were listening to a conversation between two officers, one in the field and one in D.C. at the Pentagon. They were talking to each other. And the one guy said, "Can I tell so-and-so about this?" And the other guy said, "No, that's top secret. You can't say anything." And we're listening to the conversation. And then I had a very interesting 3 months in that 3 years that I was at the security group headquarters. And the fact that, I can talk about it now. I couldn't talk about it. My wife keeps saying, I never could talk about it. I went to all places to Las Vegas. What happened during the Arab-Israeli War of the 70s, I guess it was, or maybe it was the late 60s. It might have been the late 60s. We had captured a lot of Russian radars and things like that. And we were running all of our aircraft against these Russian radars to see how we could maneuver against them and all that. And I was sent to be part of the group that was also, once again, we were trying to determine whether or not we were giving anything away in our communications. Actually, we were even sent to a bar. It was more of a cat house than a bar, about 100 and some miles north of Las Vegas. And we actually sent a guy into the cat house to listen to the conversations between the armies, between the sailors and the airmen and the young ladies who worked there. The commanding officer of the unit I was in was probably one of the finest naval officers I ever met. And when he retired, he had 2 roles in the original Top Gun movie. He was an F-14 fighter test pilot, and when they had the graduation in the movie with Tom Cruise and all of them, he was the admiral who was passing out their certificates, and the pilot, the one with the big black helmet and the dogfight at the end of the movie, that was him in the movie, yeah. So those were pretty exciting times and everything. And then what I thought that I was going to do is I was going to stay in the security group, and at that time I actually moved what they call my designator from the line officer, was a ship driver, because I thought that perhaps my thrust for the rest of my career was going to be in cryptology. And so I moved it into a cryptologic designator, and it was time for me to be rotated. And I wanted to stay in the States, and I actually wanted to go to a billet in South Carolina. And I actually talked to the commanding officer there, and he told me that he had some billets that I could apply for and all that sort of thing. And so I thought that this was what I really wanted to do. Plus, my wife was pregnant with our first child, and I wanted to stay in the States. So I went to see my detailer, and the detailer is the one who decides where you're going to go next. And I said, before you say anything, I think I have a job that I really want and everything. And he said, "No, we're taking those jobs away from those people. They don't even know about that yet." And I said, "Well, where do you think you're going to send me?" And he says, "We're going to send you to a place called Misawa, Japan." And he said, "You're going to be there for 2.5 years, and you're going to spend half your time on either ships, aircraft, or submarines." And I said, "Well, I really don't want to do that." And he said, and I'll always remember, he said, "Well, I have 10 billets to fill and 5 volunteers, and you're one of them." And I said, "Well, no, I'm not a volunteer." And I had enough time on active duty at that time to make a decision to resign my active commission and go into the reserves. And that's what I decided to do. I decided from my family's standpoint, it was better for me to go into the reserves. This was in 1977. Yeah, I've been in about 8 years. About 1977. And the economy was horrible at that time. I was trying to decide what to do. My specialty in the Navy was part of what the National Security Agency does on a national basis. So I went to the NSA, and I was already living in the Baltimore, Washington area anyhow. And I applied for a job, and I got approved for a job at the NSA, but they called me up. And once I had decided to get out of my active duty Navy, it took about 6 months to process. And so I was in the process during that period of trying to get a job. And I thought I had the job at NSA, so it was going to be a smooth transition between the Navy job and the NSA job. Well, they had a hiring freeze on. They called me up and they said, "We're sorry, we can't hire you right now, but come back to us in a year." And I go, "Well, I can't come back to you in a year. I got a family to support. I got to find a job." So I found a job in the government with what is called the Maritime Administration. And it's the agency of the government which is the promotional agency for the U.S. Merchant Marine. So I got a job there. In the meantime, however, I stayed in the reserves as a naval officer. I did my monthly drills and my 2 weeks active duty and all that kind of stuff. And I stayed in the security group during that period. Well, I found out that unless I was working at NSA, I was hamstrung about, getting promoted in that field because most of the people who were reservists worked at NSA as a civilian, and they did this on a 40-hour-a-week basis, and I was only there, a short period of time. But the job that I got with the Maritime Administration became the real crux of how I did with the rest of my naval career. Because when I was at the Maritime Administration, I got a job as a national security planning officer, which I was dealing with the Pentagon. It was almost like I was in the service. I was dealing with the Pentagon. I had a NATO role. I used to go to NATO meetings in England and Brussels and places like that and participated in all kinds of NATO exercises and stuff like that. And I became somewhat of an expert in what they called the reinforcement of Europe. During that time, it was still the Cold War, and what we were doing is we were planning in case we had to reinforce Europe at that time. We had a list of NATO ships, and there were like 600 ships that were going to be called on and given up by the different countries of NATO to move U.S. military supplies from the U.S. to NATO and to Europe. And I was the one tasked with maintaining that list of ships. So that was my job. And I had all kinds of people coming in from the reserve community who were in that discipline. And they would come in and they would come to me, and I was the one that was teaching them everything that they needed to know about that discipline. And I decided maybe what I should do is I should move back into the unrestricted line community, which is basically the seagoing community, rather than stay in the cryptologic community. So then I reapplied to go back into the unrestricted line community. At first I got turned down because they said that I wasn't qualified as what they called a surface warfare officer. Well, I went back to them. I said, I was one of the first surface warfare officers. This is the surface warfare officer insignia right there. Okay. And so I said, I was one of the first people ever selected in surface warfare. And they said, oh, really? So they let me back into the surface warfare community. And then I affiliated in that community in the reserves once again, as I did the same thing to that community as NSA did to me. I was the expert. I dealt 40 hours a week in this community. So basically, I became the expert in the community, and I had continuing roles within NATO. I went to NATO meetings all over the place. I stood watches at the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic, and places like that. And because I had such an expertise at the Maritime Administration, the Military Sealift Command, which was the Navy's organization that dealt with movement of merchant cargo rather than fighting ships, they sponsored me to go around the country and brief reserve units in this process, the reinforcement of Europe. So I created a briefing, which was about a 3-hour briefing. And for 3 years, I visited over somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 sailors at reserve centers everywhere in the country. And I gave my presentation. And so basically I would do this 2 weekends a month for about 3 years. And I would go to let's say I'd go to Albuquerque on Friday night and do a briefing on Saturday at Albuquerque at the Reserve Center there, fly to Phoenix, do a briefing in Phoenix on a Sunday, and then fly back again. And I did this for 3 years. And I got the Navy Commendation Medal for that. So I had a canned briefing. And back then, it was all, had overhead projectors. And so I carried a list of overhead projection slides that was about that thick. And I did that for 3 years, and I got that Navy Commendation Medal from that. And I stayed in that community for the rest of my time in the Navy, and I kept getting promoted. At the time, I made lieutenant commander, I made commander, and then I never thought I was going to make captain because I didn't have a command. And normally, in order to make captain, you need to have a command, even a short command. Okay? And so I thought, well, I'll probably just retire as a commander. I remember a friend of mine who was a retired Navy captain. He called me up one day and he said, "What is your Social Security number?" And I gave it to him. And he said, "You made captain." I said, "No, I didn't." I said, "No, I didn't." And he said, "Oh yeah." He said, "You're on the list." So I made captain, and I was the last name on the list. I look at it like the box score in a baseball game. When somebody hits a home run, it could be some 500-foot home run, over the fence, or it could be a bunt that turned into a home run. Well, mine was sort of a bunt that turned into a home run. So I made captain, and I stayed captain in the reserves. And of course, you got to remember, I had a civilian job now. By this time, I had left the government, and I was working in communications sales. Way back when I had been a communications officer, had trained me how I could do communications. And so I was in communications sales. I worked for civilian companies. I had a civilian job, and I had a reserve job. The military was the biggest group that I sold communications to. At that time, I was working for a company in California in communication sales. I had the entire U.S. market, plus I had Greece, because I had one of the very large contracts with the Greek army when I first went to work for this company in California. And I went to Athens 36 times in 3 years as part of this program. Wow. So I was going there and doing that, and I was also doing reserves on weekends. By this time, I had 4 children, and I'd be going home, and my wife would say, "Oh, we've got things we have to do this weekend." And I go, "No, I have to go to reserves this weekend." So I went to the reserves and did all that stuff. So it was a very busy time. Very, very busy time. And I thought I was going to be deployed. So during Desert Shield, I was in a very senior reserves unit that specialized in sea lift. And I'd gone to all kinds of places in that position all over the world. And we had gone on vacation. And, this was in the late 80s, I guess. And back then, there was no cell phones or anything like that. So I'd come back from vacation, and I had a recorder on my telephone that said that I had to go report to the Reserve Center. And I went to the Reserve Center, and they said, we're activating people in this unit individually, and you're next. And I said, okay, this is what I signed up for. Right. I wouldn't be in this organization if I didn't sign up for it. And I worked for a very supportive person in the company I worked for. And he said, okay, you're going to go, but your job will be ready for you when you get back. And so I said, well, what am I going to do? And they said, you're going to run the military supply chain between Bremerhaven, Germany, and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And I said, okay, well, that's a pretty challenging position. So that'll certainly probably keep me busy and everything. And so I went home, and I prepared myself and my family and my everything for me to go to do this. And I got a call about 3 days later from the Reserve Center. And they said, you're one of the luckiest people we've ever met. And I said, what's that? They said, well, when your orders reached the hands of the 3-star admiral out in the Persian Gulf, he made a statement and said, I don't want any more GD reserve captains out here. And so they decided to send a commander instead. So they said, we're not activating. So I said, well, I would have gone and I would have done the job and everything, but I'm very happy that I didn't. And I said, and I had just made captain. I just put on, and that's basically the captain's insignia right there. I had just made captain. I was reaching my point. When you reach your point of usefulness, and I was starting to reach my point of usefulness, I knew that I was not going to make admiral because that was going to be the next step. And I had not, I didn't even think I was going to make captain. So I knew that I hadn't prepared the path to make admiral. And I was thinking about retiring at that point. And I found out that in order to retire in the grade of captain, I had to spend 3 years in that grade. So I spent 3 years as a captain, and I retired the day I'd been in there for 3 years. I retired on October 1st, 1993. So I had 24 and a half years during that period.
Between your active duty and 93, it was always reserve.
I had the 7 years of active duty and then reserve. I had a continuous duty from May 12th, 1969, which is the day I went in, to October 1st, 1993. I was continuously in the service. Yeah. And then if you really want to count the 4 years I was in ROTC, that would have been almost 29 years.
When you were a little boy wanting to do this, you were at Villanova to do this. Had you planned on it being a lifelong journey?
Yeah. During that period when I didn't get the position that I'd hoped for, and I was going to go to Japan, which really didn't fit into my plans with my young family, I probably would have stayed. If the next rotation would have been something I really wanted, I would have had 10 years in by then, and I would have only had 10 more years to retire, so I probably would have stayed. But then I immediately went into the reserves, so I spent longer time than I needed to. And I'll tell you, it was all worth it, because I am retired. I do collect a retirement check from the government, but even more importantly to me is that I have the best health plan you have ever seen. Between Medicare and TRICARE for life, which is what I earned from retirement, basically it takes care of everything. So I have a Navy retirement and I have the medical plan. So it was well worth it. It was a lot of long periods, especially when I was trying to do my civilian work and my reserve work, and I was traveling so much. It was tough. It was tough.
Once you retired in 93, what did you do?
I had a series of employments in the communications business, the last of which was in 1998. I went to work for ComSat, which was the Communications Satellite Corporation, which is no longer in existence anymore. Once again, I had developed over my entire Navy career and my civilian career and my time at the Maritime Administration, I had developed a deep background in communications and communications sales. I went to work for ComSat, and I'd actually worked for ComSat twice before. This was my third time at ComSat. I was the vice president of sales for the Mobile Satellite Communications division, which also included all of the maritime communications. And I stayed there, and the entire ComSat corporation got bought in 2000. And so we became part of Lockheed Martin. So Lockheed Martin took ComSat and renamed it Lockheed Martin Satellite Communications or Communications Services or something like that. And I worked there for Lockheed Martin for 2 years. And then they decided that they wanted to sell our division. And I was asked to stay on until the division was sold, and we sold the division to the Norwegian telephone company. And I knew at that point in time that I was not going to be retained. I was given a buyout package, but all the young Norwegian guys and girls wanted to come to the States. So I knew that I wasn't going to last there. So I decided to move to Florida.
When did you move to Florida?
2002. When they sold us to the Norwegians, and the Norwegians took over in 2002. In fact, when I came to Florida, I was still working for Lockheed Martin, and I spent a week here in Florida and a week in D.C. So I was no longer vice president of sales, because a Norwegian came and took that. So I was like vice president of special projects, and there were no special projects. So I went back and forth 1 week here in Florida and 1 week in Maryland, and I said, this doesn't work, because they were going to buy me out anyhow. I said, look, buy me out now, and let's just call it quits. And that's what I did.
That's an incredible career. Backing up just a bit, when did you meet your wife?
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, and my wife grew up in New Orleans. And when I went to Villanova, I met a guy who ended up being my brother-in-law, who was at Villanova with me. However, he also went to high school with me, but I didn't know him because I went to an all-boys Catholic school, which had like 1,200 boys in the school. I went to all 4 years in that school. He came in about at the junior year, And so I had already established my group of friends, and he was never part of my group of friends, but we went to college together. I met him at Villanova. So when we went back to Baltimore, I'd go over to his house, and his younger sister I ended up marrying, and we've been married 53 years.
And you've got 4 kids?
4 kids and 9 grandkids.
You spend a lot of time with them, though, too, don't you?
We do, because 5 of our grandkids live in Florida, and then 2 of them live in Denver, and 2 of them live in Maryland. So my wife and I, we do a lot of trips to Maryland and to Denver, and also, with 5 grandkids here, although 2 of them are in college now. So yeah, it's busy. It's busy.
So now, after you had the buyout from your Comcast, what did you do?
I moved to Florida. I didn't really know what I was going to do. I was only 55 years old at the time, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do? I had been in sales a good bit of my life, so when I came down and looked for a house to buy, I had a real estate agent, and she took me around and everything, and I said, I could do your job. I could do this. And so I got a real estate license in sales. I have to say, I had gone from a vice president of sales for a $125 million company where I had 37 employees and 200 agents around the world to a real estate sales agent. Okay. So there was a little bit of difference there. But I adjusted to that, I think, pretty well. And I've been in real estate sales and property manager ever since.
Now that you have, your kids are grown, you've got grandkids that are almost grown. Did your military career influence any of them?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it has. My grandson, who is a junior at Ponte Vedra High School, is looking very seriously at going to the Naval Academy. And he's looking very seriously in that. He's a soccer player. He's the starting goalie on the soccer team. And he is talking to the Naval Academy soccer coach. And I think he would like to do that. Also, I took him on the Orlick. And it's funny because if you ever go onto the Orlick was the sister ship of the Lloyd Thomas. I took my family onto the Orlick last year. And we started on the tour, and they assigned a tour guide who had never really been on one of these ships. He quickly learned that I knew a lot more about this ship than he did. He said, look, I'm just going to follow you, because everything that was on that ship was actually in the same place of where it was on the Lloyd Thomas. And so I did all of that. I think my grandson would like to go to the Naval Academy. And actually he's being looked at, because he's only a junior right now, but at least looked at right now from both the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, the Merchant Marine Academy. And so a lot of these places are looking at him right now. And for him to go to the Naval Academy would be sort of special, not just because it's the Navy, but my son still lives just outside of Annapolis with his family. And my son-in-law's family all live in Annapolis still too. So he would have plenty of family right there.
Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Boy, I tell you, I think I told you most of the stories that come to mind. There was one special occasion when I was working at ComSat that, once again, we were in the satellite communications business. At that time, we were the forefront of satellite communications. So I got to become friends of a lot of people, especially in the Middle East, because the Middle East, the emirs, the sultans, all those people, they were buying communications equipment from me. And so I knew the communications advisor to the Sultan of Oman. I knew the special communications officer to King Hussein of Jordan. And I actually got to go to Bahrain one time because we had sold some equipment to the Bahrainis, and we got a call saying this equipment doesn't work. So we decided to send a delegation to Bahrain to check on this and make sure everything was fine. So I led the delegation of 2 other people, and we met up with some local people in Bahrain, and we found out the equipment wasn't broken. They just didn't know where the OFS switch was. But I spent a week in Bahrain, which was very interesting. I got to ride in the Emir's yacht and check the yacht out and everything, a 150-foot yacht. At that time, that was probably one of the biggest yachts around. And I also got a time that I spent in Emir's palace with his number 2 guy, a sheikh, for about an hour. It was very interesting. But there was a lot of things that happened in that regard. And also, we had satellite communications on the Calypso, Jacques Cousteau's boat. We hosted a 75th birthday party for Jacques Cousteau on the waterfront in D.C. And I was sent there for this birthday party to be on the yacht with Cousteau in case anybody in the press asked any questions about the satellite communications equipment. So I got to be there with Cousteau and the group. We went to a reception for him for the birthday party, and I got to meet some interesting people like John Denver and Hyman Rickover, who was the father of nuclear-powered submarines, and a few other people that were at this birthday party. In the satellite communications world, especially because we were at the forefront of this, I got to meet some really important people. I almost got to meet King Hussein. In fact, I got so close to meeting King Hussein, and unfortunately he had a change of plans, and I didn't get to go see him. I knew this fellow, Mohammed Ahmed, who was the communications advisor to the Sultan of Oman. One of the key factors, he might have been a brilliant communications mind, but he had no concept of time. He would call me up in the middle of the night to ask me a question, and I would remember that the phone would ring in the middle of the night. My wife would answer the phone, and she says, "It's Mohammed," and hand the phone to me. And I said, "Mohammed, do you know what time it is?" He said, "Yeah, it's 11 o'clock. I said, "It's 11 o'clock there." I said, "It's 4 o'clock in the morning here." I said, "Can I call you back a little bit later on in the day?" So I did get to meet a lot of people, and I got to travel in both with my Navy career and my civilian career, and the time that I was with the Maritime Administration. I got to travel everywhere. You know where they have these little things where you can see, like on Facebook, where it says, "Have you done these 50 things?" I've always done like 40 out of the 50 things, you know. Have you ever been to this place or that place or something? I've been there. Like I said, I've probably been to England 50 times. Now, I haven't been there in 25 years, but I used to go a lot. And like I said, I went to Greece every 6 weeks for 3 years. So going to all these places and everything. Now, I have to say that it's sort of, I've had my fill of all of that. I sort of like being home now. And I'm glad I was a much younger man when I did all that traveling, because it'll wear you out. And I'll tell you one other thing about the time I was at ComSat, which was very fulfilling. The job that I came in, we had sponsored an around-the-world sailboat race. It was called Around the Lone. And it was 18 sailboats. They were 50 and 60-foot boats that were captained by one person. Okay, just one person. And it was a round-the-world race. And I was in charge of the marketing for the race. And so I got to go from every location. So the race started in Charleston with 18 boats. There was 17 men and one woman, a French woman, that captained these boats. They went to Cape Town, South Africa. So I spent a week in Cape Town entertaining customers and going around and talking with the captains of the boats and everything. So I went to South Africa for a week. Then we went to Auckland, New Zealand. So I flew to Auckland and we spent time there doing the same thing. And then we went to Punta del Este, Uruguay, and did the same thing there. I remember I met Ted Turner's son and then went back to Charleston when the boats came back for the end of the race and did the same thing there. And I met a lot of really interesting people, not just from the boat captains, but the sponsors of the boats and the people, like I said, Ted Turner's son and things like that. I met a lot of really interesting people. I remember in Portsmouth, England, I was at a NATO conference one time, and I had a British Navy commander who was a friend of mine asked me to go on a tour of the Portsmouth harbor with him by sailboat. And he brought his uncle along, and his uncle was Winston Churchill's naval attaché. I spent the whole evening with him. That was another just very interesting person to talk to. So there's all kinds of interesting people in this whole trip.
How many languages do you speak?
Just English. Well, see, I always got along because I always had an agent or somebody who spoke the language. I learned how to speak some important words in Greek. I learned how to say please and thank you and things like that, but I never really learned how to speak any languages. It was funny because I showed some property today to a couple from Guatemala, and they were talking in Spanish, and I said, I don't speak a word of Spanish, I'm sorry. But I do have a son-in-law who in Denver who is from Colombia, and he speaks fluent Spanish. So there have been times when I've actually called him up and said, here, translate for me.
Well, this has worked out really well for you with your naval career, your after Navy, during Navy, after your full retirement.
It's all followed very nicely. It's all followed very nicely, yeah.
Do you and your wife get to travel?
Oh, yeah, we go on cruises and things like that. And I do have a bucket list item. One of my best friends lives in the UK. He's British. And I actually do a FaceTime with him every week. We do about a half hour every week. And he was with a company called Inmarsat when I was with ComSat. And we bought services from Inmarsat. And we became close friends, and we've been close friends for many, many years. One of the things that I really want to do before my 80th birthday, which is only 2 years from now, is I want to take the Queen Mary from probably New York, although I understand I could take it from Fort Lauderdale, take it from the States to Southampton, spend a couple of weeks with my friend in England, maybe take the Channel over to Paris for a couple of days, and then fly back. Of course, with my wife. That would be part of our bucket list.
That happens.
I hope so, too.
Did you make a reservation?
Not yet, but I think we're kind of getting close. I think we're getting close.
Well, I thank you so much for talking with me.
You're welcome.
This has just been incredible. Had this incredible career.
It's been fun.
If you are a veteran, or if you know someone who is, I urge you to share your story. Whether you fought in battle or worked behind the scenes, your experience matters. It's not just history, it's our history. It's a history we cannot afford to lose. At Legends of the Barbed Wire Hotel, we are committed to preserving these stories, but we need your help. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with your friends and family, and most importantly, if you have a story to tell, reach out to us on social media or email. Both are listed in our description. Every veteran story deserves to be heard, remembered, and honored. So join us in this journey. Together, we can ensure that the legends of the Barbed Wire Hotel live on. This is Diana Maul Halstead, the Kriegie's daughter, signing off. Thank you for listening, and to all veterans, thank you from the bottom of my heart for your service and your sacrifice. If you would like to purchase a copy of my dad's memoir, Writings from the Barbed Wire Hotel, click the link in the description. In the back of almost 800 pages is an index of all the sources I used to research my dad's military career and time as a prisoner of war. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Let's spread the word and keep these stories alive. And remember, every story matters, especially yours. Legends of the Barbed Wire Hotel was written by and produced by Diana Maul Halstead, the Kriegie's daughter. Until next time, this is Legends of the Barbed Wire Hotel. Stay safe, stay strong, and never forget the sacrifices made for our freedom. Thanks for listening.